You may have clicked on this video because your strings maybe sound something like this. But you'd rather have them sound a little more like this. So how did we get from A to B? In this video, we're going to cover a step-by-step guide on how we got there. And this video will be valuable for hip-hop producers, pop producers, orchestral composers, anyone that uses strings. In the description, there are markers, so you can kind of skip around, although if you are new to string composition, I do recommend watching the entire thing. Alright, so the first thing I'd like to start off with are things to avoid. Some of these things you may have done yourself, I know I certainly did, but these are just generally good things that you want to avoid. The first thing is synthetic or cheap sounding strings. Now it can be really tempting to pull up your favorite synthesizer like Omnisphere or Flex if you're using FL Studio, click on a string ensemble patch, play chords, and that's it. That's what you're doing for your strings. The problem with using a synthesizer, of course, is that they are synthetic. Sometimes in a synthesizer they can be sampled, but again, it's a synthesizer, you'd probably want to use a sampler. And by the way, this doesn't necessarily mean you have to spend thousands on sample libraries or hiring string players. I just mean getting a sound source that doesn't sound cheap or synthetic. It's like cooking. If you're trying to cook with garbage, it's probably going to taste like garbage when you're done. This video is not sponsored, but Audio Imperia has a suite called Nucleus Lite, an orchestral library in a lightweight package that sounds good and it's affordable. And if you don't want to pay anything, just use the strings that come with your DAW, but again, make sure they at least sound decent and that they're sampled, not synthesized. The second thing to avoid is not automating your strings. It's really tempting to, again, just get a keyboard, play your strings, and then call it a day, but make sure you're automating them and making them sound a little more lifelike. The third mistake to avoid is using the ensemble patch of a string library as your final sound. We'll get into this in just a moment, but there's a reason you have different sections in a string orchestra. Each section has its own unique tone and sound, and if you use an ensemble patch, you will not get the richness that comes with each section. So in general, it's best to separate them. More on that in a minute. And the last thing to avoid is hard quantizing your notes. Doing this is going to make them sound unnatural. In strings, they flow freely. They just sound better when they're not perfectly in time. Okay, so with the things to avoid out of the way, I want to get into what you should be doing. So to start us off, let's start with all the sections of strings. So in a typical arrangement, you have violins, violas, cellos, and basses. The violins are typically the largest section and are broken up to the first and second violins. We'll get more into that in just a moment. But each section has their own unique tone, and it's important to understand this when you're composing. You probably wouldn't want the basses to be playing a melody line that really the violins should take. So, how do you make sense of these and how do you understand them? Well, let me give you a general overview of what the different sections can be useful for. Now keep in mind, these are general rules. It won't work for every song, every arrangement, but if you're new to this, it'll really help you get in the right direction. So the violins we usually like to use for the lead melody. You can harmonize them, and they can also operate as the counter melody. Sometimes it's useful to have the first violins as the main melody, and the second violins to be the main melody an octave higher or reversed. Or another good way to go is to have the first violins be the main melody and the second violins to harmonize, or you could just have both sections doing the same thing to get a more powerful sound. Again, totally up to you, but just a few pointers. The violas are also good for melody, harmony, and counter melodies, but keep in mind they are a bit lower, so if you have a lower melody, you could use the violas as the lead. Or if you want to have the violins lead, you could have the violas do the counter melody. Again, kind of do what you want, but this is the general rundown of the sections. Now for cellos, you can kind of use them as bass, melody, counter melody. You can also harmonize, or if you want your song to be darker, they can be the lead melody. Maybe in the sad or emotional part of the song, you have the cellos lead, so again, it's a much darker tone instead of having violins lead. And the last part of a typical string section are your basses. Now obviously, it's good to have them as a bass line to just add texture, fullness, and structure to the piece. They kind of tie everything together. Now again, depending on the piece, you could have them lead. This is rare, but you know, it's music. There aren't any strict rules necessarily. So those are the main sections. What do they actually sound like? Well, here's a clip of each playing a C note. How could we use this knowledge to orchestrate a chord? Well, here's a C major chord. As we know, a C major chord is made up of a C, E, and G. In this particular arrangement, we could have the low note, which is the C, be played by the basses, since it's the lowest note. The next highest would be the cellos, we could have them on the E note, and finally we could have the violas on the higher G note. To add melody and emphasis, we could have the violins playing an octave higher, and it sounds like this altogether. Now this is just one example. You could orchestrate this any way you want. If you invert the chord, the orchestration might look differently. But again, this is just an example of how you can use the sections and how they can all be their strongest. Another tip when composing for a section, typically you only want to have one note playing per section. Now again, you could have 2 or 3 notes. But if every section is playing 2 or 3 notes, things are going to get muddy and mixed up pretty quickly. So my recommendation, always have each section play 1 note. So this next part of arranging full-sounding strings is making a sketch. Now you can either do this on an ensemble patch for strings or on a piano. I recommend a piano just so you can kind of play the strings along when you're recording, but do whatever you want. First off, let's listen to the string arrangement we have, then I'll show you the piano sketch. Okay, so pretty neat. That's the final product. But it started with a piano sketch. Let's look at that piano sketch. So pretty much here's the piano piece. I just played this, recorded it, and slightly quantized it. Here's what it sounds like. And again, the reason you want to be making these sketches is so you get an idea of what the arrangement's going to sound like, but you're also creating the chords underneath the lead melody. And this is super important. When you have a lead melody, you have to accompany it with chords to make it sound full. So in this piano sketch, here's the lead melody. I've highlighted it in red. But again, that sounds really empty without any chords, so here are the chords. Once again, everything together. Now, figuring out what chords to add over what melody is a skill that takes time to develop. Be patient with yourself. But to start off, you can kind of experiment doing different chords in the same scale as your melody. Let me know down below if you'd like me to make a video going over this topic specifically. Alright, so now that you have all these things in place, the next step, and this is the most important, is actually recording the strings. Now when I say record, I mean use a MIDI controller, preferably, that has a modulation wheel, and if you know how to play, obviously play the melody yourself, it's going to sound more natural, and you can always edit it later. Alright, so if I were going to record this, I have my MIDI controller here. I'm just going to set everything up for recording, so link my dynamics to the modulation wheel, make sure that I'm recording the automation and the notes, just kind of have the metronome on and a countdown. And again, depending on how you're going to arrange the strings, you might have the strings do something else than what I'm about to play. But I like to have the violins lead. I'm going to have them do the lead melody. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Just me recording the violins. And again, I encourage you to actually play the notes and record the dynamics. This is just to make it more natural. And that's pretty much it for recording. And the last step, but certainly not the least step, is editing your notes and the dynamics. So make sure all the automation and dynamics are cohesive, which doesn't mean they all have to be at the same level. Obviously, that would sound not human, that would sound robotic. But just make sure all the dynamics are working well together, all the notes are transitioning more or less at the same time, and that's pretty much it. So I hope this was very helpful to you. If you have to watch this a few times to do it and practice, again, be patient with yourself, but this will help a lot. If you have any questions about it, drop them below and let me know. Thank you and take care.